Today we're going to turn to our third early American document, the Declaration of Independence. We've already looked at Columbus's letter and the Mayflower Compact. If you remember, God and King were central to both of those documents. The Declaration of Independence also concerns God and King, but in a very different way, and Jefferson is very cautious in the way that he approaches them both. I will recommend that if you have not looked at the clip on active versus passive voice in verbs, that you do so before you watch the rest of this video. It will be helpful. We're going to look at individual verbs and how they work, and so it would help you to understand some of the terminology. It's also helpful to keep in mind a few things before we look at the wording. First, you want to make sure that you think about Jefferson is making an argument for the colonies to become autonomous. Jefferson is arguing that they will no longer obey King George III. That's the whole point of the Declaration of Independence. They will no longer obey the ruling authority. Also, at this time, divine right of kings would be considered as supported and believed in by many. The common man would have thought that God put the king in place. Many people would believe then that King George was put in power by God and Christians would have an obligation to obey him. Consider as we talk about these few lines how Jefferson avoids blatantly stating that the colonists may revolt because God didn't put King George III in power. This is a serious challenge to traditional belief at that time. So we want to look at the verbs. It's interesting in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence that in these very few lines we can see how Jefferson's avoiding saying something, but he's implying it because he doesn't want to bring to attention the fact that he's saying, hey, God didn't put King George in power. First we have, we hold these truths to be self-evident. In this case, hold right here, is an active verb. The subject is we, hold is the verb. You can see we would be the ones who are holding some truths. We begin with the word we because he is focusing on the common man, the people who believe things. But now, after this, we're not going to get so many active verbs, and we're not going to get stated subjects. He says, we believe that all men are created equal. Here's our next verb, are created. Well, men are created, but who did the creating? He didn't say who. So all men are created by someone. We can guess God. We tend to assume God, but that's what he wants us to think about. He wants us to just assume that it's God, but he doesn't want to say God because God would be the person that put King George in power. Again, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. He doesn't say the Creator endowed them. He just says they are endowed by their Creator. He kind of buries the Creator. Also, notice he doesn't say God. He says the Creator, but he doesn't name him. So they, the people, are endowed with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I would suggest that you look at the link to John Locke to think about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson is drawing from Locke's writing in that statement, in those rights. Then he says that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Think about that and ask yourself, who instituted the government? Scripture would say that God has put the authority and power. The colonists, many of them, would have believed that God put King George in power, and so God institutes governments. Well, what do you do when the government is bad? Can you then overthrow it? That would seem to be going against God. However, here he says, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Now, he's not going so far as to say that governments are instituted by men. He just says among men. He doesn't say who instituted, who made, who put together the government. He leaves us to wonder. If you think back to your high school composition days, you might remember that your teacher told you not to use passive voice. Oh my, look at what Jefferson did here. Are endowed, passive voice. Are created, passive voice. Are instituted, passive voice. Is Jefferson a lousy writer? I don't think so. Let's look at then the difference between what these verbs would be if they were in active voice. We hold these truths. That's the first verb. He says that instead of these truths are held by us. He wants the colonists, the people, the common man to be important. So he puts we there as a clear subject. He does not say God created men because he doesn't want to talk about God because he's about to go against the king who might be in power by divine right. God might have put him there. So he says all men are created. They are created, he doesn't say by God, but he says by their creator. Well, who else would create somebody other than the creator? And then governments are instituted among men. He doesn't say who instituted the governments. Did God make the government or did men make the government? He carefully avoids saying that. Next, we'll look at the list of grievances toward the bottom of the Declaration of Independence to discover that he does know how to use active voice. In fact, if you look at the list of grievances below in the Declaration of Independence, over and over again, you get a very clear subject, he, and multiple verbs of what he, King George, did. A bad actor, subject, doing terrible things, verbs. That will be our next discussion.